Morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Megan O'Sullivan, the North America Chair of the Trilateral Commission, and I'm pleased to see so many of you this morning, at least morning where I am. It has been a tumultuous 10 days in American politics, but we have emerged and now have a new president-elect and vice president-elect, a team that is promising a very different approach to many things, not least among them, a different approach to foreign policy. We have a fantastic trio to help us better understand what to expect in those coming months and years ahead. These three are well known to all of us. They're all members of the commission, so we're grateful to them for making the time this morning. They're all very busy, but felt this was an important group to address. Our moderator, who is well known to everyone here, is David Sanger. David, of course, we know him from his correspondence as national security writer for the New York Times, as well as for his books and expertise on cyber. But now David can also assume a new title of executive producer. He has just finished his first documentary. It's an HBO documentary called The Perfect Weapon. And as a little advertisement, we plan on bringing that documentary and a conversation about it to this group at a later date. So congratulations to David on that. I'm going to let him introduce Nick Burns and Wendy Sherman, but again, want to say how pleased I am that the three of us could join us this morning and look forward to the conversation. David, over to you.
Well, great. Thanks, Megan. And welcome to everybody, all our friends on the Trilateral Commission. It's great to be here with Wendy and Nick. If Wendy and Nick need any introduction to members of the Trilateral Commission, you're in the wrong room. But they are both undersecretaries of state for policy. I think Nick once told me that in Cambridge, there is actually a block now that has two undersecretaries of state for policy living within a few doors of each other. That is an only in Cambridge or in Washington thing, right? But before that, led very distinguished careers. Nick as a career foreign service officer, as an ambassador. I think I first met him when he was spokesman for the State Department, and when we would fly around with Warren Christopher, his briefings were known as Nick at Night, which was always my favorite, and has been a wonderful colleague at Harvard. Wendy, of course, was counselor to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Came back in the Obama administration and handled the Iranian nuclear negotiations and a wide portfolio of other issues, though Iran sucked up a huge amount of her time, and we will talk about that. Before that time, she worked on Capitol Hill. She's written a really fascinating autobiography that I urge all of you to read, that's sort of part autobiography, part how to survive the world and deal with it, both at home and on a global stage. And it's great to be with the two of them today. So let's dive right in. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes and then open this up to everybody else. Wendy, let's start with a topic you and I were discussing the other day, which is how COVID sort of affects the way you think Joe Biden's first year is going to sort out in dealing with the world, because it's not only the overwhelming issue for him and for the United States, it's the overwhelming issue for every other nation dealing with it, and every other nation that is turning inward, I should say, as they try to go deal with a great crisis at home, over which there has been far less international cooperation than one might expect.
Thank you. First of all, it's great to be with everybody this morning. Good morning, Megan and Nick and David. And I see on the screen lots of people who know lots of things about all of these issues. So I really look forward to the conversation part when we hear from you as well. I think what David and I were discussing, and Nick and I have in other settings as well, is that we all have to set our expectations clearly. There isn't a country in the world that won't be focused somewhat internally, trying to deal with the COVID challenge, restore their economic reality, and deal with the disparities that came with COVID. Here in the United States, we are in the midst, as Europe is, and now other parts of the world as well, an enormous surge. We may in fact see 300,000, if not 400,000 deaths by the end of the year. There isn't a state that is untouched by this. And we heard from Ron Klain last night, the newly named Chief of Staff for President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris, that on day one, the President-elect is going to put in a mask mandate to the extent that that can be done at the federal level, and urge governors to do it at the state level. He's going to be putting in place a team that will deal with testing, that will deal with the distribution of vaccines, that will deal with how we reopen our businesses and our schools. Really an aggressive program to get started. And that planning is going on now, so that can happen on day one. Even though we will all be internally focused, we also heard from Ron last night, and I've heard from the President-elect that immediately we're going to send some signals to all of you, rejoin the Paris Agreement, not pull out of the WHO in June, the World Health Organization, given the COVID crisis, have a commitment to the rest of the world when it comes to the vaccine, so that in fact it can be equitably distributed. We know in our own country, we'll start with our first responders, perhaps our military, but who's number 4, 5, and 6, and how do we do that? So I think I'm going to stop in a second. I think what we all have to respect about each other is, until we get in front of this COVID crisis in each of our countries, restore our economies, it's going to be harder to do many of the things that we hope to get to do together. And then the last point I'll make is that the President-elect is committed to reestablishing our alliances, our partnerships, our relationships. We know it's not going to be simple on day one, even though Joe Biden knows every single person in the world and has gotten fantastic messages of thank God you're here from many of your countries. But nonetheless, there's hard work to do, and he's going to repopulate the State Department, the intelligence agencies, the Pentagon, the rest of our apparatus, USAID. So in fact, we can interact and work with the world. I'll stop there.
Well, Nick, I'll ask you to pick up sort of just where Wendy left off there, because President-elect Biden's left no secret about where he plans to go take American foreign policy. He's made it clear that the time is up to end America first, and he talked about COVID as sort of the core to that, and the rebuilding of alliances. But as Wendy hinted there, that's going to be a lot harder than just winding the clock back to noon on January 20th, 2017. There have been vacuums that have been created. The Chinese and others have filled them. Our allies are, even if they are welcoming, as Wendy suggests, and I think they are, to Biden's arrival, they're also a bit distrustful right now. More than a few foreign ministers and others have said to me, you know, if America can go off and do this with Donald Trump 4 years ago, what's to stop it from turning back, sending the pendulum back the other direction 4 years from now, especially given the narrowness of the victory? So what do you tell them?
Well, thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, no matter where you are. I want to, David, in answering your question, I want to step back and just reinforce and agree with Wendy's first point. I think that everybody has to expect that that there's going to be a very heavy imperative to work on inside the United States first, because we have three multiple crises underway. We have the pandemic, which every country is experiencing. But as Wendy said, I think infection rates are now mounting in all 50 states. And the death toll, Johns Hopkins, which is our best source of this, could be at 300,000. It could climb to 400,000 in the first quarter of 2021. We've got the pandemic. We have a global recession and a big recession at home. And so President-elect Biden is going to have to decide, that's going to be his priority, those two issues. Is there going to be a stimulus package? Will the Republicans support that? Will there be a big infrastructure package? And if you combine those two with the third crisis, which is race, which is a profound crisis for all of you who know the United States, I really think it makes sense for Joe Biden to be focused at home first. I think that's where a lot of the early energy will be. But obviously, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. There's going to be a big international aspect to this. And Wendy has just, I think, done a very good job of laying it out. I just say on the coronavirus, it's imperative that we return to the World Health Organization. And Joe Biden has been clear during the campaign and post-election that we will do that. What could we be doing together? Well, the WHO, as everybody here knows, is important, particularly for poor countries that don't have strong public health systems, that really depend on the advice and the support. And so it makes sense that the European Union countries and Japan and the United States and other countries ought to be coalescing on what we can do to help in the distribution of a vaccine, if and when a vaccine is available in 2021. And we're going to have to learn the lessons of this pandemic to prepare for the next pandemic. And that to me means that we should have a heavy emphasis on the G7, on G20, on using those two institutions, which were not used to any degree by the Trump administration, as well as the World Health Organization. So David, I learned as spokesperson, if you don't like the question someone asks you, just answer the question you wish they had asked. But
That's right. You were really good at that, Dan.
But I will answer your question, because as you know, I'm a former U.S. ambassador to NATO. I see Carl Bildt here, a lot of great friends from Europe. There's no question Joe Biden has been a lifelong believer in NATO and in the US-EU relationship. When he was last in Europe, February 2019, at the Munich Security Conference, a year and a half ago, 2019, I'll never forget the big speech he made that day. It was a ringing defense of our partnership with the European Union and with NATO across the board. And at the end of the speech, he said, "We'll be back." And that was a prophetic speech. So what's the agenda? Obviously to rebuild NATO. Obviously to, I hope, maintain the American troop presence. I hope halt the projected troop reductions by President Trump out of Germany, which make no sense for what we've been trying to do in Republican and Democratic administrations for a long time. Certainly to maintain the sanctions on Russia. Those are the EU sanctions, the Canadian sanctions, and the American sanctions. And David, I actually think, but people here can contradict me, I think most European governments, allied governments in Asia, Japan, South Korea, Australia, are going to welcome back an engaged, forward-looking American administration. I worry about the publics, because I read the public opinion polls in Germany, which show that Putin and Xi Jinping have a higher credibility rating in German polls than Donald Trump. I worry about the public, because we left the climate change agreement. We left the WHO effectively. I think it might take longer to win the public's back. Final point. Why do I think that Europeans should trust Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the people who will work for them? That we're not going to just flip in 4 years and become Trumpian again. I'm not a political expert on the United States, but I have my own views. I think Trumpism is going to be repudiated in the next couple of years, at least the brand practiced by the president. What gives me some comfort are the public opinion polls. Now, you can't trust every poll, as we learned 10 days ago in the United States, but consistently, the American public supports NATO. The American public thinks about Canada and Japan and the European countries as our true allies. And Joe Biden won a majority. And all those people voting for Joe Biden are not isolationists. They're not people who believe we can live alone in the world. So that gives me some comfort that the American people want to see us engaged. The majority, maybe not the minority, but the majority do.
Nick, I think you're right on that, but I was having this discussion with a European diplomat the other day who made the point to me that after all we've seen over the past 4 years, Donald Trump got more votes in this past election than he got in the previous election. Now, of course, voting overall was up. But yeah, at the end of the day, he got 70 million votes. And the question I was asked was, do 70 million Americans share his worldview? And, I think that is a question that a lot of Europeans and a lot of our friends and allies in Asia and in the rest of the world are going to be asking as well.
So let's be honest with each other about that issue, David.
Mm-hmm.
Phenomena is not just an American phenomena. It's
That's
a
right.
phenomena. It's a phenomena we saw play out in Europe around Brexit. We are in a fast-moving century of rapid technological change and rapid social change. And people, and I use this example with respect, you take a 55-year-old white guy in America, and I love white guys. I've been married to one for 40 years. You all know my husband, Bruce Stokes. So you take that 55-year-old white guy who had a great manufacturing job, and he lost it, probably more through technology than through trade. And I see Carla Hills on here, so she can tell me how much she thinks trade was part of that phenomena. But he is told, take a computer coding course, and in 2 years you can earn half of what you earned. The people down the block who he always respected can get married now, and he doesn't get that. His deal with his wife was she got to stay home and raise the kids, and now she's out at work because they have to have her out at work. The people moving into his neighborhood don't look like him, and they go to the mosque. So that guy feels like his power, his dignity has been left out and left behind, and people don't respect his choices in his life. Now, I'm oversimplifying all of this, but it is to say that there are people all over the world, including swaths of young people under the age of 35 in the developing world, who are the majority, who wonder what their future is going to be and are pushing up against us to be a heck of a lot more creative and thoughtful about the enormous gap between the rich and the poor, whether it's rural, urban, exurban, urban, however you want to think about that. There is rapid change, social and technological. We have those challenges here in this country around 5G and quantum computing and AI to be able to compete with China. And we can talk lots about China. I see Joe Nye on here. He can add to that discussion, a lot of European experts as well. But at the end of the day, this gap is not just an American phenomena. And Donald Trump understood there are two ways to address that gap and that sense of loss of power. You can go with rage and fear, or you can go with hope and change. He was very effective with rage and fear. It's not gone away. President-elect Biden, Vice President-elect Harris are going to have to deal with that rage and fear. And they're going to do it by trying to bring positive results for people in real time. And that's why you heard Ron Klain last night. I'd urge you all to watch his interview on The Last Word, my plug for MSNBC, but to watch it because he laid out the most aggressive agenda on day one that I've heard in a long time.
David, can I just add to that, if
Sure.
you don't mind? I think obviously the big story of this, one of the big stories of the election was the Trump vote. It surprised everybody. It was much stronger. It was much more widespread, increased his margins, slightly in the African-American community and Latino community. It surprised everybody. And the polls were disastrously wrong. We all know that. He did get more votes than last time. Joe Biden got more votes than Barack Obama. Joe Biden got the most votes of any candidate in American history. There is a majority in this country, a majority that voted for him. It's not an isolationist majority. It's not a unilateralist majority. It's a majority that does want to go back into the climate change agreement. We're divided, but there's also a majority, and the election clearly reflects that. And I'd just say one more thing, especially on issues like NATO and Russia, which concern a lot of the Europeans and Canadians and Americans on this call. I hope I'm not being naive here, but I have a quiet hope that the senior Republicans in the House and Senate who work on the major committees they're not going to go soft on Russia as Donald Trump did. That's not how they acted. They consistently voted against Donald Trump on Russia issues over the last couple of years. They are firmly, and I know this because Wendy and I testify before these committees, they are firmly in support of NATO, and they want to engage with the European Union, senior Republicans, House and Senate. So we're badly divided at home on domestic issues. I think we're a little bit more united, blocks of people on some of these big foreign policy issues that the Trilateral is concerned with.
Wendy, Nick raised Russia, and let me pick that up with you. If you were advising President-elect Biden or his foreign policy staff about how to go proceed, obviously, as Nick pointed out, he's got something going in his favor, which is that the Republicans never voted for lifting sanctions, and in fact, overwhelmingly voted to keep those up. I suspect in the end that American intelligence assessments that Putin wanted to see President Trump reelected might be re-guessed, because I don't think he was all that useful to them on the one thing they needed the most, which was the sanctions relief. But what would you argue should be the administration's first move with Putin? And what did you think of Tony Blinken's argument, which he made to me? I had in a piece on Biden foreign policy earlier this week, that we should use the Russian overdependence now on China as a piece of leverage. Is that likely to work?
I think we have a complex landscape to think through. I do agree with Nick, though, that there is strong bipartisan support to be tough on Russia. I think it remains to be seen what investigations will either go forward or be left behind regarding Russia's interference in our election. I think it is a positive that we heard from the Department of Homeland Security yesterday, much to the surprise of the current president, I am sure, that we had the fairest, most transparent, safest election in US history. And the interference from foreign opponents or adversaries was less than it was in 2016. So I think we are in a somewhat different place, but I absolutely agree that the sanctions are going to remain on Russia for all that they have done and continue to do around the world. I think that Russia and China have created an alliance of convenience. I don't think it's an alliance of friendship or of all shared interests, but they have found it useful to be a veto bloc against the Europeans, though on a subject, as you noted, I know something about, Russia, China, and Europe have come together on the Iran deal and left the United States on the sidelines. What I think will be critical here, and I fully expect, is that early on, the Biden-Harris administration is going to sit down with Europe, not only the major countries, but the European Union, and talk through these issues and talk through this strategy. How do we need to approach Russia? We still have Nord Stream hanging out there in terms of German energy needs and European energy needs. Megan is the expert of all experts about those energy flows and what that's going to mean for what decisions get made here. We still have Ukraine, obviously, in the balance, and the illegal annexation of Crimea. We have the leftovers of the poisoning of Navalny. So there is a lot to work through, and we must work through it together because Russia is on the doorstep of Europe, even more than it is on the doorstep of the United States.
Wendy, we'll come back to Iran, which you raised in just a minute. Nick, I wanted to turn you for a moment to the China question, something we've all been taking up a lot in a joint European and Harvard group that you've assembled. But there are a few areas where I think the world has sort of changed the most, and the common view of the foreign policy establishment has changed the most since President Obama left office. Whether you liked his techniques or not, I think you'd have to say that President Trump did manage to strike a chord, not only with the American people, but somewhere around the world, as he basically turned the public view from we can manage a peaceful rise for China to we have to head into something that is more akin to a containment strategy. And you saw it in the way he dealt with 5G. You saw it in the way he dealt with the TikTok issue. You've seen it in the military pushback. And you saw it again yesterday with a ban on investing in some Chinese companies that have links to the Chinese military. It's a very different posture than the one that Biden left. And I suspect one he'll have a very difficult time reversing. Talk to us a little bit about that.
I think this is one of the most significant changes in our global policy, the big change over the last 3 or 4 years about China. And I'd frame it this way, David. We normalized our relationship with China 41 years ago during the Jimmy Carter administration, fully normalized it. And for most of that time, Republicans and Democrats thought that they were strategically engaging the Chinese and competing. It's now flipped. I think both political parties now are much more focused on competition rather than cooperation. And so that competition is in the Indo-Pacific for military primacy. It's on the whole host of trade issues that everyone here is familiar with, and Chinese inability, refusal to trade fairly. It's certainly on values because Xi Jinping, just in a big meeting in Beijing 3 weeks ago, asserted that the authoritarian system is the preferred system for countries around the world. He said, look at our performance in the coronavirus. And it's definitely on digital technologies and the militarization of those technologies, AI, quantum, biotech, going forward. So there's a big agenda there. And there's no question that both parties are swinging towards competition. The key question, I think, for us and for the Japanese and for the Europeans and Indians on the front lines with China is, to what extent do we try to balance this competitive phase with some degree of cooperation? I'm all for competition. I think we have to compete with China. But on the coronavirus, we ought to be working with China in the World Health Organization. On climate change, we're going to have the same understanding that Barack Obama did in 2015. Wendy was a big part of this. We're the 2 largest carbon emitters. We have to work together with Europe, with Japan, with India on climate going forward. That's very important. I do think this is going to test the US-EU and US-Europe relationship. I think for the most part, you're going to see an embrace of NATO by President Biden and of the European Union. It's a positive agenda, but does Europe have a policy on China? The European Union doesn't have one right now. And I think the Americans, both of our political parties, would like to see some definition of a policy that is more than Europe's equidistant between China and the United States, as some, maybe a minority, are saying. Is Europe going to have a unified policy on 5G, on Huawei? Because Britain, the United States, Australia, Japan, we're forming a very different policy. And will Europe get serious about regulation of Chinese companies? We have the CFIUS process here. President Trump just announced yesterday further prohibitions on investments in 11 Chinese companies that have ties to the military. This is the direction that the US, Australia are going in, Japan, the United Kingdom. And I do think this is going to be a major issue in the conversations with the European Union.
We've got about 10 minutes left before we go to questions. So I just wanted to remind our participants that there are 2 ways you can raise questions here. One is just put your hand up with the raise hand function. The other is you can type a question in the chat, and Cassandra's going to keep track of these for us and begin to call on people. Wendy, I'd like you to pick up on what Nick was saying about the approach on China. And since time is short, then maybe I could ask you to also give us your your short agenda about how you restart with the Iranians, using the same group or a different one than you used during the Iran talks, whether you think that the Iranians will be willing to take up President-elect Biden's invitation that he would rejoin the Iran deal that you spent so much of your time negotiating, if the Iranians will return to the strictures of that. And then after that, we can talk about, where you'd take it.
So let me just add a couple things to what Nick said about China. President Trump has taken a transactional approach towards China. It's been tactical. It hasn't been strategic in my view. It's largely been centered around tariffs, which in fact have cost the American taxpayer and the American farmers far more, I believe, than it has cost China. What I think you will see from President Biden, Vice President Harris, and their team is a strategic approach to China, which will be absolutely the competition that Nick so wisely laid out. It will be to challenge and confront where we must in terms of the South China Sea and other areas. And it will be to look for those areas where cooperation, as Nick pointed out, in climate, pandemics, perhaps a couple of other places, arms control might be one of them, that we need to work together. So it will have to be a very sophisticated, very nuanced approach. And it has to be with Europe. I could not agree with Nick more that Europe has to have a cohesive strategy towards China if we in fact are going to compete, challenge, confront, and cooperate with China. We are much stronger when we do these things together. And that will take me to Iran. I think what the Biden administration will need to do first is to sit down with France, Great Britain, Germany, and the European Union and talk about the best way forward. It was Europe, quite frankly, that held on to the Iran nuclear deal, even though it's hanging on by a very thin thread at the moment, but did so with China and with Russia. But really, it was Europe that was the placeholder for the United States. And it says something about the durability of the deal, that it did last as long as it did, even after the US withdrew. The Iranians will spend this time putting as many chips on the table as they possibly can to make any ultimate negotiation much harder. The Trump administration has put chips on the table. So I think we will have to sit down, decide how best to approach. And I agree with you, David. If indeed Iran agrees to come back into the deal in full compliance, if the US indeed also comes back in full compliance, it can't end there. The deal is now many years old. We've had a lot of circumstances. We will have to build on it and look at all of the other issues that are happening in the Middle East. I think the Abraham Accords that were negotiated are a positive, but they are not an answer. They are, again, a tactical move that is a useful one, but a long way to go. And the last point I'll make about the Middle East in general is this past week we saw the loss of Saeb Erekat, who, although never successfully was able to negotiate as the lead negotiator for the Palestinians a deal with Israel, he was a champion for a two-state solution. I knew him rather well out of the Clinton administration. And the reason I mentioned Saeb is not because there was perfection here, there was not, but there is no one right now on the Palestinian Authority side, nor is there leadership on the Israeli side to come to closure on this. But none of us should forget that the UAE made its deal around the Abraham Accords in part to ensure that Prime Minister Netanyahu would not annex great swaths of the West Bank and end the possibility of a two-state solution. So there is a very complex arena going forward, one which Europe has been greatly engaged in for many years. And this too will have to be part of the Iran calculation.
Wendy, let me just press you on one specific, because you raised Prime Minister Netanyahu. When the Bush administration was leaving, and President Obama was coming in. You'll remember that Prime Minister Netanyahu asked for, I'm sorry, he was not in office at the time, but the Israelis asked for bunker busting bombs. They asked for all kinds of equipment to be able to go take out Iran's nuclear facilities. There is certainly a discussion underway within the Israeli government now about whether or not there is a window in these next 2 months for them to act. You did see an explosion at a major Iranian facility, a centrifuge facility in Natanz back in July, early July. Do you believe that they would act while Trump is still in? And do you believe if they did, that would poison the relationship with Biden?
Personally, I hope they do not act. My own sense is the wish to act is also a wish to draw us in. And I see David Petraeus has put a note in the chat that.
Yeah, I thought this might get David going.
Right, we cannot end endless wars. We can only end our involvement. And I think that is a pretty good summary here. And I think that if Israel took action to try to destroy Iran's facilities, it would be in hopes that it would draw in the United States. And that, I think, would be quite a dangerous move.
Okay, and Nick, one very fast one for you. We haven't mentioned North Korea in the course of this, but 4 years ago, it's what President Obama told Donald Trump was going to be his most complex problem, one that you and Wendy both dealt with a lot. During the 2.5 years since the Singapore summit, the public estimates we've seen suggest the North Koreans have probably increased their nuclear stockpile of weapons grade material by roughly 30%. That might be off plus or minus, but it's directionally right. What do you do if you're Joe Biden and you step into this? Do you try to replicate the summit process? Do you go back and tell the North Koreans that they're never meeting another American president until they have begun to dismantle? What in between? Or do you basically accept that they're now Pakistan-like, that they've got a nuclear arsenal that, for all we talk about, they will never fully give up?
Well, I don't think we can accept that the North Korean nuclear weapons force is there to stay. We shouldn't just assume that and treat them like Pakistan. We've got to make another attempt to try to bring them back to some type of negotiation. I actually thought, and you remember this, David, I thought when President Trump went to Singapore, that it made sense that we would want to
definitely
make contact.
did.
It made sense that we would want to contact Kim Jong-un and see if there was any seriousness of purpose. I think the mistake the president made was he hung on far too long to that. The policy failed. He didn't recognize that he failed. He also cut Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, out of the process. He didn't bring the Japanese in closely enough. We have all failed at North Korea. Those of us in the United States, Wendy and I served in the Clinton administration. I served in the George W. Bush administration and the Obama administration. All attempts failed, but it doesn't mean you don't try again. I think the key here diplomatically would be to frame this in a multilateral fashion. You have to have Japan, South Korea, and the United States tightly knit together on strategy and in outcomes. You have to have China as part of this, because China has ultimately, if there is leverage over North Korea, China has it. And Russia is going to have to be a part of this as well. So I don't think we can give up. I don't think we can just assume that we can live with Kim Jong-un and nuclear weapons, but this is about as hard a question as we're going to face. I think in many ways it's much more difficult if you're trying to grade them and compare them than the Iran question. And David, I hope when we go to questions and comments, we'll also talk about the Quad. We haven't mentioned that yet. It's promising. I was present at the creation of the Quad back in 2005 and 6. It never really worked, but the foreign ministers came together in Tokyo a couple of weeks ago. It's a very good step that India is now binding itself in a way with Japan, Australia, and the United States. The question is, can we deepen the Quad? And can we diversify what it does? And can the militaries play a bigger role? Because right now it's being led by civilians.
Thanks, Nick. We do have a number of questions here, and Cassandra, I'm going to ask you to call on some in the beginning, but Wendy made a reference to David's intervention on the chat. Let me just read part of this to you because it raises a good first question. In the endless wars area, he made the point, as Wendy pointed out, that we can't end the endless wars, we can only end our involvement in them. But he said, given that, will a Biden administration acknowledge that reality and seek instead to manage endless wars by achieving the most cost-effective and capable sustained commitment rather than withdrawal, even as efforts to achieve a durable and responsible end to the various endless wars? And I'll note that, you know, so far what he has said in regard to Afghanistan is maintain really a small intelligence presence, but pretty much leave it at that. Either one of you want to take that up? Wendy?
I think you've said it quite rightly, David, which is both Davids. I think that the American people want to bring their troops home. That said, as Nick pointed out, taking our troops out of Europe is insane because of what we all have to face in our commitment to each other. Insane may be too strong a word, but it just doesn't make strategic sense. Second, I do believe that he will look to keep a counterterrorism presence where it is necessary, but as small a footprint as possible to do so. And I think we will hear a lot where Pentagon policy is concerned about making sure that we have a defense for the future. And that defense is going to use different kinds of weaponry, technologically based weaponry. It's not going to be the conventional weapons of World War II. It's going to be quite a different footprint in quite different ways. We all watched, and I lived in the Obama administration when we became so dependent on drones. There are a lot of very difficult questions about warfare going forward and the ethics of warfare going forward when you can, in fact, wage war from abroad with a punch of a button. So I think there are a lot of big challenges here in defense. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is all of the people being discussed for Secretary of Defense know the Defense Department, know what's going to be required in the future, know that life has changed, and will work hard with our allies and partners to really usher us into the 21st and 22nd centuries.
Cassandra, do you have some other questions you want to read out for us here?
Yes, thank you. I'll turn first to Dr. Cecilia Malmstrom. If you can please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. Cecilia Malmström, a Trilateral Commission member from Sweden, former EU Trade Commissioner. Thank you for a great session. I had a totally different question. I wanted to see what you make out of the promise by the President-elect to organize in his first year of office a democracy summit, as he has talking about. Is that just to show that he's back on the multilateral arena, or is there a expected outcome of this? So what do you make of that? Thank you.
I would just say I think this is something that that President-elect Biden deeply believes in. I guess Wendy and I also should have said at the beginning of this, both of us supported him during the campaign, advised his campaign, but neither of us is speaking for him, obviously, and don't want to say anything that would put him in a box. But this one doesn't. He has said consistently, going back to the Munich speech a year and a half ago, that the democratic countries of the world have to come together. You know, the American organization Freedom House has been chronicling for many years now the decline of democratic governments in the world. We see it in Europe and the NATO alliance. I think NATO is going to have to face the fact, and I guess the EU too. What do you do with Hungary, Poland, and Turkey that are all backsliders on democratic values? In the United States, President-elect Biden has put forward this idea there has to be some coming together of democratic countries because of the importance of reaffirming it against the authoritarian challenge, specifically from China and Russia. And we were talking, Wendy and I were in a Harvard Zoom call yesterday, and both noted how silent the United States has been on Hong Kong, on the Uyghurs, on the attempted murder of Alexei Navalny, on Belarus. Donald Trump has literally not supported any of those causes. And I think you'll see, obviously, a very different person in Joe Biden who deeply believes in these values and wants the world to be working together. Now, institutionally, there's this idea of a summit, which is a very good idea, but we do have existing frameworks. We've got NATO, and we have the US-EU relationship. We have our bilateral alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia. We have our strategic relationship with India. There are lots of ways this can happen bilaterally and multilaterally, but the energy right now is with the authoritarian countries in the global debate on democracy. And so we've got to have a comeback. And I've always supported this idea that we should have a world summit of democratic governments.
Cassandra, next up.
Next up is Mr. Carl Bildt. If you can please unmute yourself.
Carl, we still can hear you. There we go. Great.
Yeah. Sorry, Sweden again. Quite a number of different issues for the post-honeymoon period. China, obviously, I skip that for the time being. On Russia, first, let me note that the Trump administration did not follow Europe in taking measures, sanctions, following the poisoning of Navalny. I think that is remarkable. So there's a catching up to do that. Positive thing to do, new start, a couple of days to do that, and then a 5-year period to go into real strategic stability talk with the Russians. That's important, whatever our disagreements otherwise. But the most important thing when it comes to containing Russia in Europe is Ukraine. Because that's their number one ambition that is there, is to unravel Ukraine over time. And there the US has been somewhat distracted, to put it in the diplomatic terms. I hope that Joe Biden doesn't feel inhibited by sort of the domestic turmoil that has been over that particular issue, so that he doesn't re-engage with Ukraine. He was the lead man for Ukraine during the Obama administration and did extremely well. So that, I think, needs to be done. Second, just remark on the European agenda. It's a mess in the Eastern Mediterranean, and I can go on endlessly about that. That is Cyprus, that is Erdogan, that is maritime issues, that is gas issues. It's a question also of managing the relationship with Turkey. And I think as it is important to sit down and discuss how to manage the relationship with China, I hope there will be a transatlantic dialogue on also how to manage Turkey. It is a bloody important place, 90 million people in between us and the Middle East, NATO ally, as Nick knows, but a difficult customer these days.
Yeah, Carl, I'd just say maybe Wendy and I can both take a swing at this. Frankly, I had very little good to say about the Trump administration the last 4 years, but I must say I think that the State Department, I would say, stood up for Greece and Cyprus and Israel on the issue of drilling rights that are contested by Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the US has very strongly stood up for Greece in the territorial dispute with Castellorizo just off the Turkish coast, Greek territorial waters. And the measures, the very aggressive measures by Erdogan to contest the right of Greece to drill in its own waters. I think Jens Stoltenberg has played a very important role here. And by the way, Joe Biden was very vocal on this during the campaign on the Eastern Mediterranean. So I actually see that both political parties in the United States are very much focused on the rule of law and on implementing international law in terms of territorial boundaries in the Eastern Med. I'd just say quickly on Russia, there's no question New START has to be an early priority given the timeline towards February 1. And I think it's clear, and my personal view is we should renew it for 5 years to give us some space. And then we're going to have to rebuild between the Europeans, the Canadians, and Americans, a joint ability to negotiate in a very tough way with the Russians, because on hypersonics and other areas, they're violating the commitments they made way back in the now expired INF agreement. We need that kind of strategic stability well, stability in strategic realm as well as the tactical realm. And I just say, Carl, on your very good point on Ukraine, and you're right to raise it. I don't think we can be bipartisan in everything in the United States. It's a highly partisan time. But you have not seen many partisan differences over 20 years on the fact that Ukraine and Georgia, for instance, are not going to be coming into NATO or the EU any decade soon. But we ought to be working with them, both militarily and politically. They've both been helpful, particularly the Georgians in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't see that changing. And frankly, I don't see the dynamic politically in the United States changing. I think there'll be support for that kind of outreach to those countries.
And Nick, while you raised New START, was President Trump wrong to argue that China should be a member of this, even if he could have came up with the idea a little bit late in the process?
Well, he was not at all wrong to assert that China is completely unconstrained in its nuclear weapons. And China has to agree to come into the same dynamic that we've been in since the early 1960s, going all the way back to Kennedy and Khrushchev and the Test Ban Treaty. There have to be limits and there has to be stability. But I think tactically he was wrong to hold up New START. We've got to get that going. That gives us space to maneuver both in the European sphere as well as Asia. But yes, China should come into, and the Europeans should help us convince the Chinese to come into arms control regimes.
Cassandra, we've got about 5 minutes, so should we do a lightning round of some short questions and short answers?
David,
Sure.
And Cassandra, I just want to add one thing to this. Whether it is nuclear weapons or long-range missiles, there's a multilateral set of norms that need to get created. But that is a long-term, complex agenda. And I quite agree with Nick. Let's get New START done, and then let's build on that as we build a very broad and very necessary arms control and non-proliferation agenda again, that now hasn't existed or actually been renewed for some years.
And Wendy, I would add to that, needs a cyber norms element to it.
Absolutely.
Joe would probably leap in here as well.
Absolutely.
Cassandra, what do you have?
So if the following people could please speak, and then the speakers will comment. We have Ms. Nicola Brewer, followed by Mr. Ollie Wine, followed by Ms. Ursula Plasnik, followed by Mr. Hovan Kovacic.
Thank you. A UK member of the Trilateral Commission and a former diplomat. I really just wanted to add a rider to the question that Herminio put in the chat line, asking for Wendy and Nick's thoughts on a Biden administration approach towards working with Latin America generally, specifically with Mexico, and I added the rider and Venezuela. Thank you.
Mr. Ollie Wine.
Thanks, Cassandra. So what steps can a Biden-Harris administration take to rebuild the State Department and more broadly restore the appeal of public service? I think a lot of prospective public servants feel very discouraged by what they've seen the past 4 years. How do we reverse that trend? Thank you.
Ms. Ursula Plasnik.
Thank you. A comment from participant from a smaller country on applied multilateralism. In setting the tone for future dialogue, EU and US, it would be helpful if there would be less of the traditional superpower geopolitical stances and a better understanding of applied multilateralism, because the European Union is the best practice example for that. It is combined of a lot of smaller countries, and they will not be pleased with the kind of questions, where do you stand on China? Are you with us or are you somewhere else? There is, and here I disagree with Nicholas Burns, there is a EU policy on China, might not be the same he thinks appropriate or Americans might, but there is certainly no lack. So better understanding, please, and define a positive common agenda. Thank you.
And Mr. Hovan Kovacic.
Thank you very much for a great panel. Of course, I'm very interested in the Western Balkans and what's the policy going to be, or will the momentum that's now been created towards the Belgrade-Pristina talks continue in cooperation with the European Union. And you did answer my question about Turkey. Thank you.
Nick, you want to go first and I'll come in behind you.
I'm happy to. And Wendy, why don't we just divide these? Because let me answer Ali's question on the State Department and then answer the question on the Western Balkans. Ali Wine asked about the State Department. I'm a career Foreign Service officer, and I started as an intern 40 years ago this summer and have never seen the State Department in such sorry straits in terms of morale, lack of budgetary support, being denounced by the President of the United States as being part of the deep state, being fundamentally isolated from policy making. I think all of you know we have 23 assistant secretaries of state. They are ambassadorial level line managers. They're the people who run our diplomacy. Not a single one of them right now is a career officer. They're all political, the Senate confirmed ones. They're all political officers, political appointees, and that has not happened at any time in American history. We've never had a time in the history of our country where the career servants have been completely cut out. So I do think there's bipartisan interest in this. I know that the Biden transition team is very focused on this and is going to come charging out of the gates to try to lift the State Department up and give it confidence and give it support and put it back into its place. It's one of the leading components of the policy-making process. It is the leading executor, an agency that executes US foreign policy, and it needs to be returned to that place. We have a Harvard study that I've been working on with Mark Grossman and Marcy Reese coming out this Tuesday. It's a 2-year project, and it's a reform plan for the Foreign Service. My friends Bill Burns and Linda Thomas Greenfield have a Council on Foreign Relations study, which takes a different look. How do you jumpstart the State Department? I think together these two studies are going to supply a lot of good ideas. I would just say in the Western Balkans, I was very involved in the effort to recognize Kosovo in the winter of 2008, working very closely with Wolfgang Ischinger and Frank Wisner. This was an EU-US joint venture. I'm convinced that the European Union is the natural leader of a process to try to bring to some harmony, if it's possible, relations between Kosovo and Serbia. The United States must be involved, but it can't hijack the process, which is what happened under Rick Grenell and Donald Trump. And so I think the United States needs to return to that very close relationship with Europe. And on the question of whether I'm right or I'm wrong about whether Europe has a China policy, what I meant to say there is that in my conversations with European leaders in governments and out governments, there is a lot of disagreement about Huawei, and there are shifting positions. And there were some politicians in Europe a year or two ago saying, we need to be equidistant between these two big powers. And then I hear now other European voices saying, we do have to be part of a democratic group of countries on human rights issues, where China is a major violator. So I sense that you're a little bit in fermentation, which is not a bad place to be. I just don't see that there's a well-defined Europe policy. If I'm wrong about that, please correct me.
Wendy, you want the last word
Sure.
here? And we're slightly over our time, so we'll
Sure, I'll be
we'll
quick.
give you the last.
So in terms of Latin America, Mexico, and Venezuela, absolutely, it's going to have to be a focus. And part of the reason it's a focus, as you well know, is that President Trump has set out a model of telling anyone who wanted to come to the United States under our asylum and immigration and refugee laws, they had to stay in Mexico. They couldn't come across the border. It's put enormous pressure on Mexico, which is confronting its own COVID crisis. It was terrific yesterday that the president-elect announced a refugee number of 175,000 that he would put on the table in the first instance. We're going to change our approach to the world. We are a country that was built on immigration. We are all, except for indigenous people here in the United States and people who were brought here as slaves, we are all immigrants in this country. It is critical to our innovation, to our inventiveness, to our entrepreneurship, and to our future. I think you will see a big change. Venezuela is a tough problem, but it requires us to be talking to other countries in Latin America who should be taking the lead with our support and backing. It goes to the points that Nick made around human rights and how we talk about it. And we certainly will want to connect with Europe, with Spain, with other countries who have historical interest to try to, Portugal, to try to resolve how best to move forward in that arena. Then lastly, on applied multilateralism, let me just end with this. I think one of the most stirring points that President-elect Biden made in his acceptance remarks is that a future for the United States of America right now is not about the example of our power. We still are the most powerful country on the face of the earth in terms of our military, our economy, and God willing, our values coming back again. But he said it is about the power of our example. It is what we do inside our own country to invent, to innovate, to restore our democracy, to restore our economy, to end the disparities, to end our original sin of slavery and racial injustice, to get in front of COVID, to manage it, to contain it, to get past it. So I think you will see a president-elect and a vice president who in herself represents history making in the United States, an acknowledgement that we are great and full and many people of different faiths, different colors, different backgrounds, different histories. So I think America is now going to be about the example, the power of our example, not the example of our power. We will only have our power back to lead in positive ways if we become the example that we ought to be. It is the arc of history, as John Lewis said, that we are moving forward on.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end this session than with Wendy's words there. And I think that the story of the next 4 years is going to be how well Joe Biden and the team he is putting together, both people who are long experienced in this and hopefully some who are coming up along the way, are able to sort of capture just what Wendy just described, which I think is what so many hunger for. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Cassandra, for keeping those going. Megan, did you have any closing remarks for us?
No, I simply wanted to thank the three of you for a really engaging session. You can tell how we could have gone on for longer, but appreciate the insights and looking forward to the coming years and months and new foreign policy.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.